This week, we're going to begin reading Billy Budd, a novella that Melville began writing when he was 72 years old, and which was actually unfinished when he died in 1891. The draft of this story was packed away by his widow, along with some other writings, and it was only discovered about 30 years later, in 1924, when it was then published. Like a lot of Melville's works, this story takes place on the sea, and because of that, there's a lot of technical ship terminology that at times he seems to take for granted that we, his readers, know about. We saw that a bit in Taipei, and it's definitely present in Moby Dick. And it can make reading Melville's stories a bit confusing at first. But we don't have to have a mastery of every nautical term he uses, however, in order to follow along with what's happening. So sometimes if it seems like he's getting too technical with his writing, it's best to just kind of gloss over that. I think that the historical background of the story's action in Billy Budd is important to know about, so that things which happen later on in the story make sense. So let's briefly go over them now. Billy Budd takes place during the French Revolutionary Wars at the end of the 18th century. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, had been an event which sent shockwaves throughout all of Europe. The American Revolution had happened several decades earlier, but this revolution alarmed Europe in a way that the American Revolution hadn't. For one, those crazy American rebels were safely on the other side of the Atlantic, no matter what happened. So them winning their independence might have been a blow to the British Empire, but any danger that the revolution posed to Britain's citizens themselves, or to the citizens of other European countries themselves, was remote. The French Revolution, to put it one way, happened right on Europe's doorstep. Also, the revolutionaries had basically taken hostage the King and the Queen of France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Surrounding monarchies had familial ties with the King and the Queen, so they felt like something had to be done to ensure their safety. The French Revolution was also seen as more radical and more dangerous than the American Revolution. While some leaders and thinkers initially favored it, others saw right from the beginning that the people leading the movement were more interested in demolishing than they were in rebuilding. The British politician Edmund Burke, who had been sympathetic to the Americans during their revolution, wrote a scathing book against the French called Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke argued a lot of things in his book. He was afraid that too much power was being concentrated in the National Assembly, which was running things. He was afraid that the king and the queen were being mistreated and demeaned. And he feared the consequence of a country throwing off monarchy as suddenly and as radically as France had done. Other thinkers who supported the French Revolution, at least at first, took issue with Burke for making the stand against what they saw as a noble movement, basically another American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, for example, thought that it was a great thing, and he wanted America to support the French more than others did, like Washington himself, who thought that while they might support the French in spirit, it wasn't a very prudent thing to do. America was still a brand new nation. They were still trying to settle in to the idea of running themselves as a country, so going off to a foreign war, Washington and others weren't very keen on that. But Thomas Jefferson was all for supporting the French in the beginning. Thomas Paine, another American thinker, famously the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," he responded to Edmund Burke's book in a book of his own that was called The Rights of Man. And in it, Paine basically argues with every point that Burke made and accuses him of being a monarchist. The merchant ship that Billy Budd is initially sailing on when this story starts is named after Paine's book, The Rights of Man. So the owner of that ship was someone who would have agreed with Thomas Paine and who would have been sympathetic to the French cause. But as time progressed and things began to fall apart in France, Most European monarchs came to the conclusion that if they didn't do something soon to stop what was happening, it would threaten their power too. So, France ended up finding itself in a war against all of these powerful European monarchs, from Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and some others. And these wars lasted all the way into the 19th century, and they called for lots of men to fight them. France started a mass conscription policy, which was basically the draft, compulsory enlistment into the military. And many of the other countries had to adopt similar policies as well. Britain, for example, practiced the policy of impressment of sailors from private vessels into the British Navy in order to have enough hands to man the ships. And that's what happens to Billy Budd at the start of the story. Britain had been doing this for many years. It wasn't just a result of the French War. This was a practice going all the way back to the 1600s, if not even earlier. And the impressment officers were sometimes called the press gang by non-military sailors because they were in charge of pressing others into the service. And basically, during wartime, a ship from the British Navy could pull up alongside a merchant ship or a private ship, pick out the best sailors, and forcibly enlist them into the Navy. The sailor usually wouldn't have had a chance to go home and say goodbye to his family, or to get his affairs in order, or anything like that. And the terms of his impressment could be anywhere from a few months to a few years. So during this time period of war, young men would suddenly disappear on the seas. There would be no word of where they went, or how long they would be gone, or anything. And they would even sometimes take sailors from ships belonging to other countries. So, for example, during this period, Britain got on America's bad side because British officers were pressing sailors from American fishing vessels into their navy as well. And then when George Washington and some others said, hey, you can't do that, they backed off. At one point, in Billy Budd, the narrator mentions even a suspicion that one of the officers might have been impressed into the Navy straight from the jail. And that was a possibility too. The longer a war went on, the fewer men there were to man the ships, so officers would scour the countryside looking for any random vagabond or lowlife to lend a helping hand. Two other novels that come to mind in which impressment plays an important part are The Trumpet Major by Thomas Hardy and Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell, both British authors. And if you're interested in how the practice really tore apart the lives of citizens who were just minding their own business, you might check those books out as well. They're both good reads. Anyway, Billy is impressed onto a warship, the HMS Bellipotent, at the start of the novella, and he goes quietly. Not all sailors did. But Billy is described as someone who takes all of the twists and turns of life with a carefree, easy grace. Melville goes out of his way to describe Billy's character and his physical appearance, and we're left with the impression of something like a man-child, an innocent, wide-eyed youth who's suddenly been tossed among the rough, jaded sailors or tars of the British Navy in wartime. In fact, the other sailors take to calling him Baby Budd as a nickname because he seems so childlike and innocent. So listen to this description that's made of him, that Melville makes of him. He says, habitually living with the elements, and knowing little more of the land than as a beach, or rather, that portion of the terraqueous globe providentially set apart for dance houses, doxies, and tapsters, in short, what sailors call a fiddler's green, his simple nature, Billy's, remained unsophisticated by those moral obliquities which are not in every case incompatible with that manufacturable thing known as respectability. But are sailors frequenters of fiddler's greens without vices? No, but less often than with landsmen do their vices, so-called, partake of crookedness of heart, seeming less to proceed from viciousness than exuberance of vitality after long constraint. Frank manifestations in accordance with natural law. By his original constitution, aided by the cooperating influences of his lot, Billy, in many respects, was little more than a sort of upright barbarian, much such perhaps as Adam presumably might have been ere the urbane servant wriggled himself into his company. Notice that Melville is portraying Billy Budd more like the romantic writer's notion of a noble savage than he even portrayed his cannibals in Typee and in Moby Dick. Billy is not merely a sheep among wolves, but an Adam among fallen men. And he attributes this, at least partly, to Billy's always having lived out at sea, and having never been corrupted by the vices of the cities on land. So, once again, Melville is returning to one of his favorite themes, the corrupting influence of society or of civilization on the individual. We get character sketches for at least two other individuals, and it's really these three characters, those two and Billy, around which the story revolves. One is the ship's captain, Edward Fairfax Vere, and he seems out of place among his sailors as well, but for different reasons than Billy does. He is a learned man. He takes a small library with him wherever he sails, and he's enlarged his thinking by studying all of these writers of the past. But because of this, he sometimes gets strange looks from his crew and from his fellow officers. They think he seems a bit dreamy, and they can't always follow along with what he's saying because he's bringing in all these obscure references from books that he's read. Another important character is John Claggart, the ship's master-at-arms, who the narrator explains is basically the ship's policeman. And the sketch that we get of Claggart isn't flattering. He's accused of having a natural depravity, though this doesn't manifest itself by any of his outward actions. He uses civilization, rather, and sobriety, and his good manners as a cloak to hide what's really lurking in his heart. And he even seems unconscious about this himself. We read, "But the thing which in eminent instances signalizes so exceptional a nature, a depraved nature, is this. Though the man's even temper and discreet bearing would seem to imitate a mind particularly subject to the law of reason, not the less in heart he would seem to riot in complete exemption from that law, having apparently little to do with reason further than to employ it as an ambidexter implement for effecting the irrational. That is to say, toward the accomplishment of an aim which in wantonness of atrocity would seem to partake of the insane, he will direct a cool judgment sagacious and sound. These men are madmen, and of the most dangerous sort, for their lunacy is not continuous, but occasional, evoked by some special object. It is protectively secretive, which is as much as to say it is self-contained, so that when, moreover, most active it is to the average mind not distinguishable from sanity, and for the reason above suggested, that whatever its aims may be, and the aim is never declared, the method and the outward proceedings are always perfectly rational. Now something such an one was Claggart, in whom the mania of an evil nature, not engendered by vicious training or corrupting books or licentious living, but born with him and innate, in short, a depravity according to nature." So, this is the sort of person who is the ship's master-at-arms, and we see that he takes an irrational dislike to Billy Budd. And why might this be? Billy Budd has done him no harm. He's barely spoken a word to him. But Claggart, almost from the beginning, seems to be secretly plotting the young sailor's downfall. We'll talk more about Claggart during our live discussion, but think about that. Think about his motives for why he would hate Billy so much. One other bit of historical background that's important to note is that the British Navy at this time is held in the grip of a sort of paranoia over mutinies. The narrator tells us about two that have happened recently, one at Spithead and one at the Norre, and both had been put down with relative ease, as the narrator goes over. One of them at least appears to have been founded on legitimate grievances, which the army redressed. But you can imagine how a country might feel about its navy succumbing to mutinies in the wake of an event like the French Revolution. All over Europe, there were fears that order was going to collapse, that the mob was going to rule the state, and that a revolutionary fervor was spreading like a sort of plague across the continent. So anything that savored even remotely of disloyalty or treason was going to be viewed with heightened suspicion and dealt with more harshly than perhaps it otherwise would have been. And we'll see next week, in next week's readings, that Claggart attempts to use this paranoia as a way in which he can hurt Billy. So, for next week, finish reading the novella, and we will talk about the ending then. Thanks.